Hey, folks. Again, I haven't been back down to where my clapper is. I'm going to have to order a second one, Pete, because I figured I'd be down in Puerto Rico, but of course, you know,
Things
man
happen.
man proposes and God disposes, as they say, which means, of course, that the Hurricane Fiona hit, and I wasn't able to get back to the house. I instead had to stay up at the apartment, and so it's down there, Pete.
Let me tell you something. Fiona's just a little itty bitty stepsister to Ian.
Sadly, you're right. And
Unfortunately,
that one's heading right for Pete, folks,
yeah.
on the
You know what?
western side.
They love coming right to the house like there's a daggone, it's just getting pulled every time I get out. They drag me back in. Brutal.
Um, Folks, just as I said on social just a little bit ago, if you're tired of the macro BS, you've come to the right place
Yep.
because we're going to give it all it deserves. 1 minute of macro. So, for instance, Pete, let's talk about Bitcoin for a change because, all of a sudden we had some exchanges start to actually look like they're going to survive. Instead of being liquidated, they are coming back out. And Sam Bankman Fried and others are buying up assets for pennies on the dollar. And boom, Bitcoin jumps, Marathon Digital jumps, MicroStrategy jumps, Coinbase jumps. They're all up.
And there's one other thing that's jumping, John. It's the 10-year. It's damn near at 4. End of story. You know what? If everybody else could figure out the macro and say, you know what? We got this backdrop, but that's all it is the backdrop. Now we still got to go with the refined area. But instead, they spent so much time just, regurgitating what they read on some other financial website. It's sickening. So here we are, 1 minute, 3, 2, 1. Let's get after it, John.
Boom. All right, let's do it, folks. Let's start off, Pete, with AMC, because you and I kind of made fun of the idea that they listed APE, APE, and spun it off as a cashless dividend to all of their shareholders. That's fine. It's kind of like, okay, talk about things that don't really matter. But what they're going to do with this now, Pete, is what they said they were going to do in the first place. They're going to raise money by selling APE shares and hoping it doesn't smack AMC shares, even though, of course, they're spun off, they're made from the same cloth. But at least initially, it was seeing some positive results for both stocks on this announcement.
Well, John, I'd say this, and you know this better than anybody. Hope is not a strategy, and that's exactly what these guys are doing. It's why the stock last November was $40. And oh, by the way, all of a sudden in January, it was $23. And now we're sitting somewhere in the sevens on a really big spiking day. We got over $7 a share. But John, the biggest problem is their debt. They say they're going to sell this to be able to take care of their debt. I'm not sure they got $10.5 billion worth of APE. So from that standpoint, I'm going to say they're still going to have debt. They still have a problem because the problem is post-pandemic, the movies have pretty much sucked, right? So there's been some good ones and there's been some not so good ones. But regardless of that, they just aren't able to do well, John. And that's unfortunately where they stand right now. And that's why I think the stock is sitting on its rear end. And I'm not so sure, other than a short squeeze, how this thing goes higher right now.
It's getting a big thumbs down from me, Pete. I'm not buying into this, deal here, if you want to call it a deal. Yeah. So I'm pretty sure you're in the same boat. What about energy, though, Pete? Mm-hmm. Yesterday, energy, it was hitting new lows for 2022. And then today comes back. It was up a couple percent. Now it's up 1.6%. I'm talking crude oil, that form of energy. We all know there's wind, there's solar, there's geothermal, there's also natural gas. But the specific energy we're talking, Pete, has lifted a lot of those energy stocks in the oil and gas space.
Yeah, and when you look at it, John, I think what it comes down to is, well, the brilliance of the guy sitting in the Oval Office, how he drained 200 million barrels We have far less in terms of if we need to tap into it. This is a problem because it's the lowest levels in the basically call it 40 years. So there are problems there, and we could see something start to happen with crude. But I think that's why people right now, John, are looking around and saying, you know what? There are companies out there that can survive, not only survive, but thrive with oil where it is right here. I'll give you one name alone. How about a Diamondback? These guys are crushing it. As long as oil holds somewhere north of 70, they're in a great spot. There are other names as well. So it's something that's really interesting to see watching this play out. And oh, by the way, I'm not sure what the Saudis are doing, John, but I think that they're not happy with the oil price right now. It might start to go a little bit higher. And then some of these names, I think, sprint.
Yeah. And folks, you've also heard about Nord Stream 1 because Nord Stream 2 was never completed. But Nord Stream 1, the pipeline from Russia into Europe, has dropped in pressure to the point where zero is going through that. And that's a big deal. So even though we're talking primarily crude oil with CVR, CVX, ExxonMobil, they've all got a little bit of the other stuff too, Pete. But this is why I'm saying all of those stocks I just talked about, thumbs up.
Yep, absolutely.
How about this one, Pete? Cracker Barrel, CBRL. I mean, Jared, we wanted you to get us that one country song with Applebee's. Applebee's on a date night.
I'm not sure, John. Here's what I got to tell you. This ain't no Waffle House.
No. And it's not Mastro's either, Pete. It's not Mastro's. So, I mean, when Cracker Barrel's doing well, I'm not saying that means, oh, the country's going to heck. But this is what many of us might refer to as a trade down stock. Instead of taking your gal or guy or whatever gender out to a date night, you might instead have to downgrade to a Cracker Barrel more often than you did otherwise when times were good, when you could afford Olive Garden. But I think overall, Pete, what they announced today was basically that they had a revenue miss, but they offered upbeat guidance. And I suspect the guidance is upbeat because of just what I described.
Yep. And let's be honest, at every single level, John, people are getting hurt, and they're getting hurt by inflation. And inflation, then everybody feels it. And there's, Cracker Barrel, let's be honest, the community that they service are a little bit older, and they're a little bit more conservative with how they spend and what they can afford, what they feel like they can afford to spend. So, Cracker Barrel and some of these other names, they feel some of that pressure. So revenues come down a bit, but maybe, you know what, maybe they start to attract a different crowd set as well. And maybe that's the reason for the guidance that they're getting to the upside. They did have the earnings, as you said as well, John. Their earnings were actually pretty solid, but it was the revenue that everybody was focusing on. So when they did come out with, hey, look, we still think the revenue for 2023 is going to be better, that's what people sort of hung on to and really liked what they heard. So that gave it a bit of a positive spin, no doubt.
I'll tell you another one with positive spin, Pete. Dick's Sporting Good, DKS. Despite the fact that the market rolled over pretty hard, Dick's is holding on to over a 6% gain here. And that's because they call it a signing day, Pete, where they go out and they get a bunch of people to come work at Dick's. And they signed up for it, and the stock is still moving to the upside here.
Yeah, it's the seasonal thing, John. Last year they had, I think last year was a record year. If I'm wrong, but 10,000 people signed up on their signing day. They treat it like as if it's a college kid who's deciding, oh, which hat am I going to grab? Is it going to be USC? No. Is it going to be Michigan? No. I'm going to Minnesota, baby. That's why Minnesota's doing so well. But they got 9,000 this year, John, for signing day. That's the expected number. And I'll tell you what, when you look at Dick's on the balance sheet side and everything else, John, there's a lot of interesting parts about this company. You look at where the PE is in the single digits. That's what people are kind of looking for right now. There's nowhere to hide. But when you look at how Dick's has performed as a stock, it's performed pretty good. And I think part of that is the idea that They aren't expensive. They have a solid balance sheet. They've got a lot of the things that you would want in a company when you're trying to find who is a little bit safer, at least, than the majority of what we're seeing in the market right now. And I think certainly Dick's has been providing us with some pretty good stuff, and their numbers are strong, and I think they could get stronger. That's why they're getting all those people to work for the season.
Yeah. And folks, I'd encourage you to pull up DKS because it's literally unchanged on the year
Yeah,
and unchanged in a year when you've seen this kind of volatility
that's
and this kind of move to the downside in the last few weeks. That's why people feel comfortable holding on to Dick's right here.
yeah.
All right, Pete, I'm going to throw out an unusual activity in an area that I think you and I both like a lot, and that's steel.
Mhm.
Letter X, U.S. Steel. It's nearly a $19 stock. Let's call it $18.80. And they were buying, Pete, the October 21 calls, buying them in big numbers, 5,000. Again, if you're somebody who only trades stock, this would be okay, a stock that you might want to put on your watch list to buy. If you're an option buyer like Pete and I, then you're probably saying, well, I could buy the 19 calls and sell the 21 calls, or I could buy the 20 calls, sell the 22s. You get the idea. You could structure a trade in options and risk a very small amount of money to get double or perhaps even triple your money on a small move in the stock. So they're buying the 21 calls with the stock under 19. 5,000 is 500,000 share equivalent. I really like that, Pete.
I like it too, John. Definitely. I own that stock, so I've been buy writing it for a long period of time. But I will say this, for my unusual, I'm going to go to one that's been in the news for a long, long time, and they have gotten their face torn off. And I'm talking about Kohl's. And you look at Kohl's, and John, the problem is this. In April and May, this was a $60 stock. There was all these rumors about takeovers. You got all these other folks in there. These activists are involved. I mean, this has really just been a stock under siege. But it's now down to 26 bucks a share. I mean, from
Yep.
60 to 26. That's kind of a holy crap moment, right? The
Yeah.
dividend yield is high. That's not important because, of course, it's high. The stock's been absolutely slammed, and those yields start to go a little bit higher. People get all excited about that. They're bleeding cash. They got a 17% short interest in this stock. So
Wow.
if it were to turn and burn, John, they're going to be squeezing a lot of the folks that have been those late sellers to this stock. They're buying 3,500 of the 28 strike calls out in November, very first week in November, paying about $1.40. They're spreading those off. I'm not going to talk about that, but it's a $7 spread. But they're buying those 28 strike calls. Stock's trading 26. Could this happen? The actual answer would be, oh, heck yeah, it could, especially with the short interest. If it gets into that position, like a GameStop or like an AMC or like a lot of these names that we've talked about for a long time. So it becomes very intriguing, and they still have the activists in there as well, John. So because of all that, I think Kohl's becomes a pretty interesting trade.
Yep. I would give it a thumbs up on that one, Pete. I
Yeah.
joined you on that trade. I like it.
Mhm.
And I think November gives you a pretty good catalyst, which is, of course, Black Friday.
Yep.
Pete and I frequently say, folks, that you buy many of these retail stocks, especially if they're battered, just after Labor Day, and you sell them into Black Friday.
Yeah.
Guess what the third week in November is? The week before Black Friday. So, yeah, I like that trade, Pete. And I definitely have joined you in that one. All right, let's talk a little sports because we had an interesting one last night. The Giants were going for 3-0. They didn't get it.
Mhm.
A quarterback nobody's ever heard of except for Pete has actually led the Cowboys for 2 wins in a row and might be saving Mike McCarthy's job. But talk about whatever you want, Pete. Lead us off into sports.
Yep, and I'll tell you this, you're right, John. I think Dallas actually is looking at Cooper Rush, started scratching their head a little bit because, quite frankly, he has performed whenever called on. He's performed for them. He's performed for others. He was a great quarterback out of Michigan in college. Actually, not Michigan, Central Michigan, the Chippewas. So, anyway, the kid's a great kid. But the interesting thing, I think, going into the NFL, John, is this. We got that hurricane that, of course, is all the news, right? Well,
Mhm.
Tampa's supposed to have a home game. and they are supposed to be playing the Kansas City Chiefs. You know what the odds are right now? Here's what's happening. First of all, they are flying as we speak to Miami to practice for the next few days. Then they're going to have to make a decision. What are we going to do for the game? Is Tampa going to get ripped up? Is it going to be a major issue, enough of a major issue because of this hurricane that they can't play there? The next decision they have to make is, oh, they might come right here to US Bank Stadium right here in Minneapolis because the Minnesota Vikings are going to London and they're going to be playing the New Orleans Saints. Our stadium is wide open. You know who's going to be at that game if it comes here? Oh, yeah, baby. My Buccaneers are around my neck every single day of my life. I love these guys. They're fantastic. The other thing in the NFL, I'll just mention real briefly, injuries out the wazoo, John. Have you ever seen anything like this year's energy? I'm talking offensive linemen, running backs, quarterbacks. Everywhere you look, guys it's like a triage. It's unbelievable. I don't know if I am exactly right on this, John, but I'm going to give you mine and you tell me yours on this one. The reason, in my opinion, is they don't practice. They never wear full pads. And when they do, they never really tackle. They never really go through all of the absolutes. And 99% of the players don't play in the preseason. They let all the scrubs that are trying to make the team like me try to show themselves that, hey, maybe I should belong here too. So I think that's the biggest problem. What about you? What the heck is going on?
Yeah, I agree, Pete. And I think any of the men or women, because you could have been playing soccer and know that it's different if you're not out there and somebody's not doing a sliding tackle on you in soccer. Because we've all seen it on, virtually every level of soccer. And when you're playing football, you need a few of those dings here and there. You don't need to get your head hit, but you do need to basically build up the toughness of your bod. If the first time you're out there, you get, lit up, forget about the head injuries and things for a second, but you get hit right there in the side hard, Pete. If you've been hit repeatedly for the last month, it's not really a big deal. You get right up, shake it off, and you go back to the huddle. If that's your first hit of the year that you took right in the breadbasket or right in your ribs or whatever, you're going to go to the sidelines. And again, as Pete has said, folks, the people who I love these players. It's not like I'm saying let's coddle them, but obviously there has to be some reason so many are getting injured. In the past, they would have blamed it all on artificial turf, Pete. Now I think you're dead on saying it's probably something bigger in the lack of contact that is really at the center of all these injuries.
Yeah, and I think that the Players Association's done a really piss poor job about that, John, because they're the ones that pushed for less practices, less this, less hitting, all of that for sort of the right reasons. But unfortunately, there's also the other side of the coin, which is, all right, you don't do that. These guys really aren't ready for game day, and they aren't. So let's jump to college football real quick. College football, John, Pac-12. Usually I'd say, you know what? This bunch of losers has got nowhere to go. I'm not saying that right now because Washington may be for real. They're 4-0. They look pretty daggone good. And on the other side, UCLA. This is a Friday game, John. They're 4-0 as well. And they're looking pretty good. But I will say this, Michael Penix, who used to play for Indiana, and I talked about this team last week on Thursday, about how they are much better than people probably realize. This guy's got 12 touchdowns, 1 interception. He leads the NCAA in passing yards. They've got the #1 yards per game team in all of college football as well. They're pretty interesting. You flip it over to UCLA, you've got another guy who's a great quarterback who doesn't have exactly the jaw-dropping numbers, but they're 4-0, and it's a team that looks pretty interesting this year. So Friday night, I think everybody's going to watch. And by the way, that UCLA team, John, they're averaging 41 points a game on offense themselves. So they are putting out a lot of offense on both sides. Typical Pac-12 form. They're not very physical, and neither team has a defense, but they should be pretty interesting matched up on Friday. You like that game, or is there something else?
No, I like that game. I think that's going to be the one. If it was on Saturday, Pete, it would be the #1 most watched game. As it is on a Friday, I hope that people actually tune in and see them because, as you know, one of the issues with the Pac-12 is that, you know, the 3 hour time difference from the East Coast to West Coast, that, you know, generally hits as far as the numbers of people that watch.
Yeah.
So I think this is actually going to be a prime time, and people are going to want to watch to see if either of these teams are USC ultimately, and that team is loaded.
They are, but they struggled, man. They barely beat whoever
Yep.
was last week. Oregon State, I think, John. I mean, an Oregon
They looked
State should have
past them.
won the game. So,
Yep.
you know, the Pac-12, I ain't so sure if any of those guys, any of them, including SC, are going to be in that Final Four. We'll see. It'll be interesting. It's a long season. Well, that was awesome, John, and I agree with you. I like your take on that one with Washington.
Yep, I like Washington to pull it out, Pete, mainly because of that quarterback that you've been highlighting all year.
Yep.
Folks, we will be back Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Remember, if you're tired of macro and you'd like some discussion on trades, we gave you 4 of our outlooks for the best stocks this day, and 2 unusual activities. So you don't get that anywhere else. Make sure you join us on Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and I'll be back later today with 3 p.m. Eastern Time. See you then.